When we think about God's plan for our lives, we tend to look at it through such narrow lenses. We think about things like, where is He going to lead us to live? What kind of work will He give us to do? Who will we marry? Maybe we think about deeper things like how God can change our hearts to build godly character and mature faith in us. Or maybe even we'll think about how God could use us in ministry to impact other people for Christ. But that's usually about as far as we go. But we need to understand that God is up to something much, much bigger than what you and I see in our lives and in the lives of people around us every day. We see that in the life of Joseph. Many people look at his story as a story of how God rescues this young man from poverty and from slavery and from prison, and then raises him up to become one of the most powerful men in the world. And yes, that did happen in the life of Joseph, but God was up to something much bigger than that. That's not the point of the story. The story of Joseph is about God's plan for His people. And He uses the difficult circumstances in Joseph's life so that he would be in a position to rescue God's people when famine came to their land. At the beginning of today's reading, in Genesis 40 to 43, we find Joseph in prison. Now the chief jailer had seen Joseph's character, and he knew that it was because the Lord was with Joseph, and so he put him in charge of all the other prisoners, which included Pharaoh's baker and Pharaoh's chief cupbearer. And one night, both of these guys have disturbing dreams, which then the Lord uses Joseph to give the interpretation. When the cupbearer was restored to his position with Pharaoh, Joseph assumed, like we would, that this was God's way of giving him a way to get out of prison. But God was doing so much more than that. And so time dragged on while Joseph remained in prison for another 2 years. But God had prepared Joseph for what comes next. Chapter 42, now Pharaoh has a dream, and none of his wise men can interpret it. And the cupbearer remembers his time with Joseph and tells him about it. Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and Joseph tells him the meaning of his dream. He says that the Lord was giving him these dreams in order to warn him about famine that was coming, so that they would be able to store grain in the years of plenty before famine hits. Well, Pharaoh's impressed with Joseph, and he says, well, who else would be in charge of this but you? He makes Joseph his second in command, and he puts Joseph then, when famine comes, in charge of selling grain to people who come from different nations to get food. And at the beginning of chapter 43, who were the first customers that we're specifically told about? Joseph's brothers. And this is what God was doing all along. He was putting Joseph in this place, but for a lot of different reasons. One was to bring Joseph's brothers to him so that there could be forgiveness and reconciliation among Jacob's family. Another was to preserve God's people during a time of famine. It was also then to pave the way for Jacob's small family to come to Egypt to live, where they would have a safe place under the protection of Pharaoh to grow and multiply and become a great nation as God said that He would make them. And also, don't miss this, He was preparing them to be put in a position where they would be slaves for many years. Because when He put them in slavery, He was putting them in a place then where God could show His power, where He could accomplish a great deliverance that would make Him known throughout the whole world. So no matter where he was, Joseph walked with God. And no matter where he was, it says the Lord was with Joseph. He was faithfully and patiently and sovereignly at work in every moment of Joseph's life. But it wasn't to make Joseph's life better. It wasn't to make him a big man in Egypt. Because if that was the reason, then so what? He became a big man for a few years, and then like all of us do someday, he became a dead man. But God was doing something much more, something much bigger than just working in Joseph's personal life. He was making it possible for millions of people to know God because of what He did in Joseph's story. And not just in those days, but something that has continued for the last several thousand years, and even up to today, because here we are talking about it. We need to open our eyes to recognize that God is up to something much bigger and something much more wonderful in our lives and through our lives than you or I could ever begin to imagine. Our job is not to plan those results. Our job is not to figure out what it is that He's doing. Our job is simply to walk with Him closely and then to trust Him to be God. And when we do, like He was with Joseph, like He's been with so many others, whether we actually recognize it immediately or not, God will be faithful to work through us in ways that only He can do. And the result of that will be that through what He does in our lives, He'll lead generations upon generations of people to come into an everlasting, life-transforming encounter with the love and the person and the truth of Jesus Christ.